My name is Charmaine. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer who built algorithms for private equity firms, I escaped their toxicity long ago, but maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of duty. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. "You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged into the private server, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about foreclosing on their estate. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue, at my mother Elaine's insistence despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and tried to be the perfect daughter. It was never enough. My sister Chloe, 3 years younger, was the golden child. While I was studying, Chloe was shopping. While I was building my first computer from scrap parts, Chloe was being groomed to take a fake executive title at my father Desmond's logistics company. Desmond was a proud man who cared only about optics and his standing in our affluent African-American community. To him, my tech career was not a real job because I worked from home in casual clothes instead of wearing designer suits to a corner office. When Chloe married Terrence, a slick-talking wealth manager with fake Rolexes and a leased BMW, my parents treated him like royalty. When I married Jamal, a quiet man who wore plain cotton shirts and drove a 10-year-old Honda, they treated him like the help. They did not know Jamal owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta and that my software firm managed billions in assets. We preferred living in peace, but peace was never an option with my family. The real breaking point happened later that Sunday evening. After the brunch ended with my mother's pitying remarks, we were all expected to attend the mandatory family dinner back at the Fairfield Colonial House. The dining room was oppressive. Crystal chandeliers glared down on the heavy mahogany table. Chloe sat there dripping in diamonds that I knew she could not afford on her fake vice president salary. Terrence stood at the head of the table waving a glass of expensive scotch, holding court like he owned the place. Jamal and I sat quietly at the far end, completely ignored. Terrence was aggressively pitching my father on a new investment. He paced the room, his voice loud and arrogant. "Desmond, you have to trust me on this one. The logistics company is doing great, but you have all this dead equity sitting in the warehouse properties. I have an exclusive in on a guaranteed offshore fund based in the Cayman Islands. If we take out a second mortgage on the main distribution center for $2 million, I can triple it in 6 months. It is completely risk-free. The returns are locked in at 20% quarterly." My father nodded along, completely mesmerized. Elaine patted Terrence on the arm, calling him a financial genius. I looked at Jamal. We both knew the math did not make sense. As a software developer who built risk assessment algorithms for Wall Street, I knew a scam when I heard one. Guaranteed 20% quarterly returns do not exist. I tried to stay quiet, I really did. But watching my father prepare to sign away his legacy to a fraud made my chest tight. "Actually, Terrence, that math is fundamentally flawed." My voice cut through the room. Everyone stopped and turned to look at me. The silence was heavy. Terrence narrowed his eyes, his fake friendly smile instantly dropping into a sneer. "What did you say, Charmaine?" Terrence asked, gripping his scotch glass. I set my fork down and looked right at him. "I said the math does not work. If a fund guarantees 20% quarterly, it is not generating alpha through market investments. It is paying early investors with new investor capital. Furthermore, moving leveraged debt into an offshore account triggers federal tax penalties that would wipe out any imaginary profit you are claiming. If Dad takes out a second mortgage, he is risking his entire logistics network on a phantom asset. For a second, nobody spoke. The truth hung in the air, cold and undeniable. Then my father's face turned purple with rage. He did not direct his anger at Terrence for trying to scam him. He directed it entirely at me. Desmond slammed his heavy hands down on the mahogany table. The crystal glasses rattled. "You do not even have a real job, so shut your mouth!" His voice boomed through the dining room. "How dare you come into my house and insult your brother-in-law? Terrence handles millions. You sit in your pajamas typing on a keyboard all day. You know nothing about business. You know nothing about the real world." My mother, Elaine, immediately jumped in. She stood up, her face twisted with disgust. She walked over to the coat rack in the hallway, grabbed my cheap wool coat, and threw it across the room. It landed right on my dinner plate, knocking over a glass of water. "You are a jealous, bitter woman, Charmaine." Elaine scoffed, her voice dripping with venom. "You have always been jealous of Chloe and Terrence. You cannot stand that they are successful while you and Jamal are struggling nobodies. We only invited you out of pity, but you cannot even be gracious. Next time, do not ever come back to this house. You are a disgrace to this family." Chloe sat there smirking, sipping her wine. "You really should leave, Charmaine. You are ruining my appetite." I looked at my family. The people who were supposed to love and protect me were treating me like trash on their shoes. I felt a familiar sting in my eyes, but I refused to cry. I had spent 35 years crying over their rejection. I was completely done. I picked up my wet coat, stood up from the table, and smoothed down my dress. Jamal stood up beside me. He did not say a word, but his presence was a warm shield against their coldness. "You are right, Mom," I said softly. "I really have no place here." We walked out of the dining room and headed for the front door. Terrence followed us into the foyer, laughing loudly. "That is right. Go back to your cramped little apartment. Maybe if you save up, you can buy a new coat next year." I opened the heavy wooden front door and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The driveway was empty. Jamal had dropped off his old Honda at the mechanic that morning, so we had taken a hired car to the house. Terrence stood on the porch, leaning against the pillar, waiting to mock us for calling a taxi. "Where is your ride, Jamal?" Terrence taunted. "Did it break down again? Do you need a bus pass?" Jamal just checked his watch and smiled. Right on time. At that exact moment, a low, guttural roar echoed down the quiet suburban street. The sound of a high-performance engine cut through the night. A pair of sharp LED headlights swept across the manicured lawn. A brand-new custom matte black Porsche Panamera glided up the driveway and came to a smooth stop right in front of the porch. The car looked like a stealth fighter jet, sleek, aggressive, and undeniably expensive. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a crisp uniform stepped out. He walked around the car, handed Jamal a heavy set of keys, and bowed slightly. "Good evening, sir. The vehicle is fully detailed and fueled." "Thank you, Marcus," Jamal said, slipping the keys into his pocket. Jamal walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for me. I turned back to look at the porch. My father had stepped out of the house, followed by my mother and Chloe. All of them were frozen in place. Desmond's jaw was practically on the floor. Elaine dropped her wine glass, and it shattered on the stone porch, red wine pooling around her expensive heels like blood. Chloe's eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated shock. I smiled a genuine, relaxed smile. "My ride is here," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Have a wonderful evening, everyone." I slipped into the butter-soft leather seat of the Porsche. The luxury interior smelled of new money and success. Jamal got into the driver's seat, the engine purring like a caged beast as he revved it slightly. As the reality of the situation finally hit them, Terrence completely lost his mind. He ran down the porch steps, his face red and sweating, pointing a trembling finger at the car. "That is a rental!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking in desperation. "You hear me? That is obviously a rental car. You two are broke. You are faking it. You are trying to make us look bad. Who did you borrow the money from?" Jamal rolled down the window just an inch. He looked at Terrence with calm, chilling eyes. "Check your offshore fund tomorrow, Terrence. Let us see who the real fraud is. Jamal rolled the window up, shifted into gear, and we pulled out of the driveway. I looked back in the rearview mirror. Terrence was screaming on the lawn. Desmond was gripping his chest. My mother was leaning against the pillar, looking like she was about to faint. The fortress of expectations was finally beginning to crumble, and I was holding the sledgehammer. This was only the beginning of their downfall. I did not cry that night. As Jamal steered the Porsche down the winding, tree-lined streets of Fairfield, leaving my screaming family behind on the manicured lawn, I did not shed a single tear. I did not lose a minute of sleep over their theatrics, or my mother's cruel words. The 35 years I had spent begging for a seat at their table were officially over. By 7 o'clock Monday morning, I was standing at the head of a massive glass conference table on the 40th floor of Vanguard Capital in downtown Atlanta. My firm. The private equity empire I had built from the ground up, the one my family blindly assumed was just me doing freelance data entry in my pajamas. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the early morning sun caught the edges of the city skyline. I was wearing a tailored ivory suit that cost more than Terrence's leased BMW. My executive team, a brilliant group of financial analysts and corporate lawyers, sat around the table hanging on my every word. We were finalizing the acquisition of a regional supply chain network, ironically, a network twice the size of my father's logistics company. I was in my element. I was completely in control. The bruised, rejected daughter from the night before did not exist in this room. Here I was, a predator at the top of the food chain. As the board meeting wrapped up and my executives filed out, my assistant walked in holding a thick manila envelope. Her expression was perfectly neutral, but I could tell by the stiff way she held it that it was not our standard portfolio report. "A process server just left this at the front reception desk for you," she said, placing it carefully in front of me. I thanked her and waited for the heavy glass door to click shut before I broke the seal. I slid the heavy stack of papers onto the table. It was a formal civil lawsuit, accompanied by a draft of a criminal complaint. The plaintiffs listed at the top of the page were Desmond and the Family Logistics Corporation. The charges were corporate sabotage, breach of fiduciary duty, and gross financial mismanagement. According to the brilliantly fabricated narrative in these pages, I had intentionally mismanaged the family company ledgers 3 years ago. Back then, I had briefly stepped in to help them organize their digital accounting software before my father fired me for pointing out his reckless spending. Now the lawsuit claimed my supposed errors had created a massive $3 million deficit. It was a complete fabrication, but it was a calculated one. Terrence was currently bleeding the company dry to fund his crypto gambling and his fake millionaire lifestyle with Chloe. He needed a scapegoat for the missing millions before the bank audited them. He had convinced my father that the missing money was my fault, a delayed implosion from my time handling the books. They were trying to pin Terrence's active embezzlement on me using altered historical data. I did not panic. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity wash over me. They actually thought they could intimidate me with fake legal threats. They thought I was a helpless freelancer who would cower at the sight of a lawyer's letterhead. I picked up my phone and sent a quick text to Jamal. They took the bait. I needed a strong espresso. I left my corner office and took the private elevator down to the high-end cafe situated in the lobby of my building. The cafe was a bustling hub of corporate power players smelling of dark roasted beans and expensive cologne. As soon as I stepped out of the elevator bank, I saw them. Chloe and Terrence were sitting at a corner table near the window. They had clearly tracked me down, assuming the address on my company registration was just some shared co-working space I rented by the hour. Chloe was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, looking like a cheap imitation of a reality television star. She had a faux fur coat draped over her shoulders despite the mild weather. Terrence sat across from her looking incredibly smug, his hands resting on a cheap leather briefcase. They looked entirely out of place among the actual millionaires conducting business around them. I walked over and pulled out a chair uninvited, sitting down directly across from Terrence. "You guys are up early," I said, signaling the barista for my usual order. I hope you did not drive that leased BMW all the way downtown just to buy me coffee. Terrence's smug smile faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the marble table. He popped the latches on his briefcase. We are not here to play games, Charmaine. I assume you got the package we sent upstairs to your little desk rental. I got it, I replied calmly. It was very creative. I did not know you wrote fiction, Terrence. Terrence slid a printed financial ledger across the table. It stopped right in front of my hands. It was doctored perfectly to show funds being diverted from my father's operating budget into dummy accounts under my initials. We know you are broke, Charmaine Terrence sneered, his voice dropping low so the neighboring tables would not hear. Renting that Porsche last night was a cute stunt, but it does not change reality. Desmond is furious. He is ready to hand this entire file over to the FBI by noon tomorrow. Wire fraud carries a heavy federal sentence. You are looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe lowered her sunglasses, peering at me with eyes full of malicious glee. You really messed up this time, she said, stirring her iced latte. Dad is entirely done with you. He said he wants you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But Terrence convinced him to give you one final chance to make it right. Because Terrence is actually a good person, unlike you. I looked at my sister. The delusion was almost impressive. And what exactly is this final chance? I asked, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Chloe exchanged a knowing look with her husband. Give up the deed to grandmother's estate, Charmaine. There it was, the real motive. When our grandmother passed away 5 years ago, she shocked the entire family by leaving her sprawling historic estate entirely to me. She knew Chloe was irresponsible and my parents were obsessed with liquidating assets for quick cash. The property was sitting on prime real estate and was currently valued at roughly $1.5 million. My family had been trying to pry it out of my hands ever since the reading of the will. It is worth $1.5 million, Chloe continued, tapping her acrylic nails against the table. Sign the deed over to the logistics company to cover the debt you caused. If you do that, Terrence will convince Dad to drop the charges and keep the police out of it. You lose the house, but you stay out of prison. It is a generous offer considering what you did to our family. You have until 5 o'clock today to bring the signed transfer papers to my office, Terrence added, tapping the heavy face of his counterfeit Patek Philippe watch. If you do not show up, I am calling the federal authorities myself. We have you dead to rights, Charmaine. The accounting traces back to your login credentials. You cannot fight this. I reached forward and picked up the printed ledger Terrence had provided as his definitive proof. I took my time. I let the silence stretch between us as I scanned the columns of numbers. My eyes moved past the fake transaction dates and landed on the routing numbers he had fabricated for the destination accounts. I had to suppress a genuine laugh. Terrence was incredibly arrogant, but he was also incredibly lazy. He had not bothered to invent random routing numbers for his fake ledger. He had used the actual offshore accounts he was currently using to siphon my father's money in real time. I recognized the Cayman Island routing prefixes immediately. I knew them because my private equity firm had been quietly tracking the financial bleed of my father's company for months, preparing for a hostile takeover. Terrence had literally just handed me a printed document tying his fake allegations to his real, highly illegal offshore bank accounts. I smiled. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or defend my innocence. I calmly folded the forged ledger in half. What are you smiling at? Terrence snapped, his bravado slipping slightly as he noticed my lack of fear. This is not a joke. I opened my authentic Hermes Birkin bag. Chloe rolled her eyes, undoubtedly assuming it was a counterfeit I had bought from a street vendor. I slid the folded ledger inside, letting it rest against my platinum corporate credit cards and the keys to my penthouse. I looked Terrence dead in the eye, dropping the polite facade entirely. You just gave me the murder weapon, Terrence. I stood up from the cafe table, adjusting my bag, leaving the forged ledger inside. Terrence reached out, panic finally breaking through his smug facade, but I was already walking away. I left them sitting there with their cold coffees and their collapsing lies. Jamal was waiting for me outside. I slid into the passenger seat and handed him the ledger. We had everything we needed to bury them right then and there. But my family was not done digging their own grave. They wanted a public spectacle. They were about to get one. By Thursday, my mother Elaine realized her legal ambush had failed. I had not surrendered the deed to my grandmother's estate, and I had not called begging for forgiveness. True to her nature, she immediately pivoted to her favorite weapon, social assassination. Our family attended the most prominent megachurch in Atlanta, a sprawling campus with a congregation of thousands. It was a place where social currency was measured by the extravagance of your Sunday attire and the zeros on your tithing envelope. This Sunday was the highly anticipated annual Building Fund Gala. Elaine knew I would be there. It was the 5-year anniversary of my grandmother's passing, and the church was dedicating a new community wing in her honor. Elaine saw this emotional milestone not as a moment of reflection but as the perfect stage for my execution. Elaine had spent the entire week working the phones. She called every prayer circle leader, every choir director, and every senior church elder. She spun a tragic, masterful tale of my supposed betrayal. She told them I had stolen money from my father's business, that I was trying to legally evict my parents from their home, and that Jamal and I were living a life of sin and greed. She painted herself as the heartbroken, long-suffering matriarch, just trying to keep her family together. When Jamal and I arrived at the church banquet hall that evening, the hostility in the air was suffocating. The massive hall was lavishly decorated with towering arrangements of white roses and glittering crystal centerpieces. Hundreds of Atlanta's elite were mingling, draped in designer silk and tailored suits. But the moment Jamal and I walked through the heavy oak double doors, the ambient chatter abruptly stopped. Entire tables turned to glare at us. Whispers erupted like dry leaves catching fire. We did not even make it to our assigned table before the ambush began. Pastor Davis, a commanding man with a booming voice, intercepted us in the center aisle. He was flanked by 3 senior deacons, forming a literal wall of righteous indignation blocking our path. Pastor Davis looked down at me with profound disappointment, clutching his heavy gold cross. "Charmaine, we need to have a very serious conversation before you take your seat," Pastor Davis said intentionally, keeping his voice loud enough for the surrounding congregation to hear. "Your mother has been in my office weeping for 3 consecutive days. It is deeply troubling to hear the path you have chosen. Leaving your parents facing homelessness over a petty financial dispute is not the way of the Lord." Before I could respond, Chloe sashayed into the center of the confrontation. She was wearing a stunning custom-fitted emerald silk gown, but it was the jewelry resting on her collarbone that caught my immediate attention. It was a massive, brilliant cut diamond cascade necklace. I knew luxury assets well. That single piece of jewelry easily cost $50,000. She placed a manicured hand on Pastor Davis's arm, looking at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Pastor, please do not be too harsh on my sister," Chloe said, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed fake sympathy. "She has just lost her way. Terrence and I have offered to empty our own savings to cover my parents' living expenses, but Charmaine is holding grandmother's estate hostage out of pure spite. We are just praying for her heart to soften." I stared at the $50,000 diamond necklace glittering against her skin. That necklace was purchased with the exact money Terrence was currently siphoning from my father's logistics company. They were wearing stolen corporate funds while accusing me of bankrupting the family. The sheer, unadulterated audacity was almost impressive. One of the senior deacons, a man who used to eat dinner at our house when I was a child, shook his head in disgust. "The scripture commands us to honor our father and mother, Charmaine," he scolded. "How can you stand in this holy place knowing you are tearing your family apart out of greed? You need to apologize tonight. You need to sign that property deed over to your father and make things right before God and this entire congregation." Jamal shifted his weight beside me. His jaw tightened, his protective instincts flaring at the public disrespect, but I placed a gentle, reassuring hand on his arm. I did not need him to fight this battle. I looked directly into the pastor's eyes. "Pastor Davis," I said, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of guilt, I am here tonight solely to honor my grandmother's memory and to support the community center building fund. I am not here to entertain fabricated family drama or defend myself against lies. The pastor frowned deeply, clearly offended that I was not crumbling under his spiritual authority and public shaming. "The Lord loves a cheerful giver, Charmaine," he said sternly. "But he first demands repentance. Until you make things right with your parents and your sister, we cannot in good conscience accept any financial offering from you tonight." "Oh, I am quite certain you will accept this one," I replied softly, stepping around the wall of deacons and leading Jamal to our table at the back of the room. The evening dragged on. The choir performed, a catered dinner was served, and my mother Elaine continued to cast tragic, wounded glances in my direction from her seat at the VIP table near the stage. Finally, the main event commenced. It was time for the Building Fund donation drive. Pastor Davis took the stage standing behind a grand acrylic podium. He spoke passionately about the church's heavy financial burdens, specifically highlighting the remaining $250,000 mortgage on the new community center annex. He called upon the wealthiest families in the room to step up, pledge their support, and demonstrate their faith. My father Desmond stood up proudly. He grabbed the roaming microphone and puffed out his chest. "The logistics company pledges $5,000 to the Lord's house," he announced. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Elaine beamed, making sure everyone saw their supposed generosity and godliness. Then Elaine took the microphone from his hand. "And we also ask for your continued prayers for our family during this incredibly difficult season." Elaine announced, her voice echoing mournfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. "As many of you know, we are facing a terrible betrayal from our own flesh and blood, but we still choose to put the church first." She looked directly at me across the massive room, a smug, victorious glint shining in her eyes. The entire congregation turned their collective gaze toward my table in the back, waiting to see me break down in shame or run out the door. Instead, I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my ivory suit, picked up my phone from the table, and walked calmly down the center aisle toward the front of the hall. The whispers started immediately buzzing like a hive of angry hornets. People assumed I was walking to the altar to confess my sins and beg for my parents' forgiveness. Pastor Davis looked hesitant and slightly alarmed as I approached the podium, but I confidently reached out and took the main microphone from the stand. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting crisp, clear, and utterly unapologetic across the silent room. "My mother is absolutely right about one thing. We must put the community first, and we must also value truth above all else. My grandmother Dorothy, whose name is on this new building, taught me that truth is the only foundation worth building a life upon. She also taught me that when you are blessed with true abundance, you do not boast about a $5,000 pledge while wearing $50,000 in stolen diamonds. You simply solve the problem." Gasps echoed from the front rows. I pulled up the custom, highly secure banking application on my phone, the one linked directly to Vanguard Capital's philanthropic wing. "Pastor Davis," I said, turning to look at the bewildered clergyman, "you mentioned the community center mortgage has an exact remaining balance of $250,000. Is that correct?" The pastor nodded slowly, looking completely lost. "Yes, $250,000 exactly." I tapped the screen, entering the church's public routing information that was printed on the back of the gala brochure. I typed in the amount. $250,000. I authorized the massive wire transfer with my thumbprint. A satisfying green confirmation checkmark instantly illuminated my screen. I held the phone up high so the pastor could see the digital receipt. "The transaction is complete, Pastor," I announced into the microphone. "The mortgage is fully paid off in honor of my grandmother. You can check the church's master account balance right now on your tablet." The pastor hurriedly pulled out his iPad, his hands trembling violently as he logged into the church's banking portal. He stared at the screen, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. He gasped audibly into his lapel microphone. The sound echoed through the hall. The congregation went so dead silent that you could hear the air conditioning humming. "It is true," the pastor whispered, staring at me as if I had just descended from the ceiling. "The mortgage is cleared. The entire $250,000 balance has been deposited." I turned slowly to look at my mother's VIP table. Elaine looked like she had just been struck by lightning. All the color had completely drained from her carefully contoured face. Her mouth was hanging slightly open, her fake tears entirely forgotten. Desmond was gripping the edge of the banquet table so hard his knuckles were bone white. Chloe's hand flew up to clutch her diamond necklace, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. If I had the liquid capital to casually drop $250,000 from my cell phone on a Sunday night, I was not a struggling freelance bookkeeper. And I was definitely not someone they could bully into surrendering a house. I placed the microphone gently back on the acrylic stand. I did not ask for a round of applause. I did not ask for an apology from the deacons. I simply walked back down the center aisle, took Jamal's hand, and walked out of the banquet hall. We left them sitting there, drowning in the blinding light of my actual success. But Terrence, feeling desperate and cornered by his own lies, was about to make the biggest mistake of his miserable life by coming after my husband. Terrence was a cornered rat. After my display at the church, he knew his time was running out. He could no longer rely on my mother's social warfare, and he certainly could not intimidate me financially. But Terrence was a narcissist, and narcissists never believe they have lost. They simply look for a softer target. He assumed that because I had money, Jamal must be a gold digger, a leech riding my coattails. In Terrence's twisted mind, Jamal was the weak link in our armor. Desperate to gain leverage, Terrence hired a cut-rate private investigator to dig into Jamal's past. He paid the man entirely in cash, undoubtedly siphoned from my father's dwindling business accounts. The investigator spent 3 days running background checks, digging through old public records, and searching for any skeleton he could find. Eventually, he hit what Terrence believed was the absolute jackpot. He found a sealed juvenile record from when Jamal was 17 years old, living in a rough neighborhood in Baltimore. The file did not contain any details because the record had been expunged by a judge. It was actually a minor misunderstanding involving a friend's borrowed car, a situation Jamal had cleared up decades ago. But Terrence did not care about the truth. To him, a sealed record meant a dark, violent past. He immediately assumed Jamal was a former convict, a thug who had somehow manipulated his way into my life and was secretly spending my fortune. Terrence took this flimsy piece of information straight to my father. Desmond, still reeling from the humiliation at the church and desperate to regain his feeling of superiority, swallowed Terrence's lies without a second thought. They formulated a plan. They were going to trap Jamal, extort him, and force him to turn against me. On Wednesday afternoon, my father's secretary called Jamal. She formally invited him to a mandatory family intervention at the Oakmont Reserve Country Club, an incredibly exclusive membership-only golf club where my father spent most of his weekends. The secretary made it explicitly clear that I was barred from attending. It was to be a meeting strictly between the men of the family. When Jamal hung up the phone and told me about the invitation, I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing acquisition contracts. I looked up at him and raised an eyebrow. "Are you actually going to go?" I asked. Jamal poured himself a glass of water, a slow, relaxed smile spreading across his face. "Oh, I would not miss this for the world," he replied. I did not worry for a single second. My family had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. The Oakmont Reserve Country Club was a bastion of old money and strict social hierarchy. It was a sprawling estate with perfectly manicured greens, towering oak trees, and a clubhouse that smelled of expensive cigars and aged leather. My father prided himself on his membership there. He used it as a weapon to assert his status over everyone else in our community. Jamal arrived at the club at noon exactly. True to his nature, he did not dress to impress them. He wore a simple, high-quality black polo shirt, tailored dark jeans, and clean sneakers. He looked comfortable, understated, and entirely unimpressed by his surroundings. The valet took his keys, and Jamal strolled into the grand lobby. He found Desmond and Terrence sitting on plush leather armchairs on the private outdoor terrace overlooking the 18th hole. They were both wearing expensive linen suits, smoking imported cigars, and drinking top-shelf scotch. They looked like men who believed they owned the world. "Sit down, Jamal." My father barked, not bothering to offer a greeting. He gestured sharply to a stiff wooden chair across from them, intentionally choosing the least comfortable seat at the table. Jamal sat down, resting his forearms on his knees, projecting an aura of total calm. "What can I do for you, Desmond?" Terrence leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious excitement. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He slammed it down on the glass patio table with dramatic flair. "We know who you really are, Jamal," Terrence sneered, tapping his manicured fingers against the cardboard. "We know you are not some innocent, quiet husband. We know about Baltimore." Jamal looked at the folder, then looked at Terrence, his expression entirely unreadable. "Is that right?" My father took a slow drag from his cigar, blowing the smoke directly across the table toward Jamal. "Do not play dumb with us, boy," Desmond said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think because Charmaine has a little bit of tech money you can ride her coattails and disrespect this family. Terrence had a private investigator look into your background. We have the sealed juvenile records. We know you have a criminal past. You are a thug pretending to be a gentleman." Terrence crossed his arms, leaning back with a victorious smirk. "If your corporate employers knew they hired a former convict, you would be fired by the end of the day. If the elite social circles in Atlanta found out Charmaine brought a criminal into our family, she would be ruined. We have all the power here, Jamal. We hold your entire life in our hands." Jamal did not blink. He simply looked at the folder. "What is it exactly you want, Terrence?" Terrence leaned forward again, lowering his voice into a theatrical whisper. "We want you to pack your bags and leave Charmaine. But before you do, you are going to convince her to sign the deed to the Fairfield estate over to the logistics company. You are going to tell her it is the only way to save your marriage, or whatever lie you need to spin. You get her to sign the papers and you disappear. If you do that, we will destroy this file. If you refuse, I am sending copies of your criminal record to every major employer news outlet and country club board in this city. You will be back on the streets where you belong." Jamal stared at them for a long, heavy moment. The silence on the terrace was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of golf clubs hitting balls on the green. Desmond and Terrence sat there, chest puffed out, waiting for Jamal to crumble, beg, or panic. Instead, Jamal started to laugh. It was not a nervous chuckle. It was a deep, rich, genuinely amused laugh that rumbled from his chest. He laughed so hard he had to shake his head, leaning back in the wooden chair. My father's face immediately flushed dark red. "What is so funny?" Desmond demanded, slamming his fist on the table. "You think federal records are a joke? We are about to end your entire pathetic life." Jamal wiped a tear of laughter from his eye, letting out a long sigh. "Terrence, you really paid a private investigator for this. You should ask for a refund." Jamal stood up from his chair. He did not look intimidated. He looked incredibly bored. He turned his back on them and looked toward the glass doors of the clubhouse. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers twice. Inside the dining room, the general manager of the Oakmont Reserve, a stern, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Sterling, immediately snapped to attention. He practically jogged out onto the terrace, bypassing several wealthy members to rush directly to Jamal's side. "Yes, sir. Is everything all right?" Mr. Sterling asked, his voice laced with the utmost respect and a hint of nervous urgency. Terrence scoffed, looking at the manager. "Sterling, tell this man he needs to leave. He is causing a disturbance and he is not a member here. Desmond and I are trying to conduct private family business." Mr. Sterling ignored Terrence completely. He kept his eyes entirely focused on Jamal, waiting for instructions. Jamal looked at the manager, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Mr. Sterling, my father-in-law, and his guest seem to be confused about how things operate around here. Could you please remind them who holds the deed to the Oakmont Reserve Country Club and the 300 acres of prime real estate it sits on?" Mr. Sterling did not hesitate. "You do, Mr. Jamal. You purchased the property and the management rights entirely in cash 2 years ago through your commercial real estate holding firm." The color instantly drained from my father's face. The expensive cigar slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the pristine stone patio, sending a shower of gray ash over his expensive leather loafers. Terrence sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. He looked from the manager to Jamal, his brain completely unable to process the information. Jamal looked down at my father, the amusement finally fading from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard steel. "I grew up in Baltimore, Desmond," Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave. "I learned very early how to spot a hustler, a fraud, and a coward. The two of you sit here drinking scotch you cannot afford, trying to extort me over a traffic violation I had when I was a teenager. You talk about legacy and power, but you are drowning in debt and entirely dependent on the daughter you treat like garbage." Jamal picked up the manila folder from the table, ripped it entirely in half, and tossed the pieces onto Terrence's lap. "Mr. Sterling," Jamal said, never breaking eye contact with my father, "revoke Desmond and Terrence's memberships immediately. Cancel their locker access, freeze their dining accounts, and have security escort them to their vehicles. If they ever set foot on my property again, have them arrested for trespassing." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Mr. Sterling nodded sharply. He turned to my father, his professional demeanor turning icy. "Gentlemen, please stand up. Security is already on the way." My father tried to speak. He tried to muster some final shred of dignity, but his voice completely failed him. He was being publicly thrown out of his favorite sanctuary, stripped of his most prized social symbol by the son-in-law he had spent years treating like a peasant. Jamal did not stay to watch them do the walk of shame. He simply turned around, walked through the clubhouse, and drove his Porsche back to the city. Terrence had tried to play a game of chess with a man who owned the entire board. And while my family was busy reeling from this humiliating eviction, the bank was finally ready to drop the guillotine on their failing logistics company. The humiliation at the Oakmont Reserve was a devastating blow to my father's ego, but it was nothing compared to the financial earthquake that struck exactly 48 hours later. While my family was busy reeling from their humiliating eviction from the country club, the massive festering wound Terrence had created inside the family business finally ruptured. The logistics company was heavily leveraged, running on a razor-thin margin that had been entirely decimated by Terrence siphoning millions into his offshore crypto accounts. The corporate accounts were completely drained. Payroll was bouncing. Vendor checks were being returned for insufficient funds. The illusion of the great Desmond legacy was shattering in real time. The final fatal blow arrived on Tuesday morning via a certified federal courier. The courier bypassed the corporate office and drove straight to the Fairfield mansion, demanding a direct signature from the company's guarantor. My father, still nursing his wounded pride, and a heavy glass of scotch in his dark mahogany study, signed for the thick manila envelope. Inside was a formal notice of immediate default from First National Bank. The primary commercial lender was officially calling in the entire $5 million line of credit. The bank cited multiple severe covenant breaches, unexplainable capital hemorrhaging, and a sudden catastrophic drop in the company's liquid collateral. They demanded full repayment of the $5 million within 14 days, or they would begin seizing all corporate assets, including the Fairfield mansion, which my father had foolishly listed as secondary collateral. Panic did not just set in, it exploded. Desmond collapsed into his leather desk chair, the heavy watermarked paper trembling in his hands. His face turned the color of wet ash. He could barely breathe. The logistics company was his entire identity. It was his proof to the world that he was a self-made king in the Atlanta business scene. Now he was staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy, public disgrace, and the loss of the very home that served as his fortress of superiority. He immediately summoned Terrence to the mansion. Terrence arrived 30 minutes later, looking incredibly pale and sweating profusely through his expensive designer shirt. Terrence knew exactly why the bank was calling the loan. He knew the audits would eventually uncover his massive embezzlement. But Terrence was a parasite, a master of deflection, and he was not about to go down for his own crimes. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed one fast. "This is Charmaine!" Terrence shouted, slamming his fist down on my father's desk, pointing aggressively at the bank notice. "I am telling you, Desmond, this has her fingerprints all over it." My father looked up, his eyes bloodshot and confused. "What are you talking about? How could Charmaine do this? She is just a freelance developer." Terrence paced the floor of the study, weaving his desperate, brilliant lie. She is a vindictive hacker, Desmond. You saw what she did at the church with that massive wire transfer. You saw how her thug husband bought the country club just to embarrass us. They are obsessed with destroying you. Charmaine used her tech connections to anonymously flag our corporate accounts. She fed fabricated risk models to the First National auditors. She tipped them off to freeze our credit lines just out of pure spite, because you rightfully put her in her place at Sunday dinner. It was a completely absurd theory, entirely devoid of logic or financial reality. But my father was desperate. He was a proud, arrogant man who could never admit he had failed, and he certainly could never admit he had trusted the wrong son-in-law. Blaming me was easy. It fit perfectly into his narrative of the ungrateful, jealous daughter ruining the family. "She wants us homeless!" Elaine shrieked from the doorway. My mother had been eavesdropping, her hands clutching the lapels of her silk morning robe. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess. "If the bank takes the house, where will we go? The church will find out. The entire country club circuit will know we are bankrupt. I will not be able to show my face in public again. Desmond, you have to fix this immediately." Fixing it required $5 million in liquid cash, something my father absolutely did not have. Driven by sheer terror, Desmond spent the next 48 hours aggressively trying to liquidate his life's work. He locked himself in his study, skipped meals, and worked the phones like a desperate telemarketer. First, he called his closest friends from the country club, the men he had played golf with for 20 years, the men he had bought expensive dinners, for the men who constantly praised his business acumen. He pitched them a temporary bridge loan, offering generous interest rates. One by one, they politely declined. Some claimed their money was tied up in trusts. Others simply stopped answering his calls altogether. In the brutal world of high society, the smell of financial death is highly contagious, and nobody wanted to catch it. Next, Desmond tried to sell off the physical assets of the logistics company. He contacted direct competitors offering to sell his massive warehouse distribution centers and his fleet of 70 commercial freight trucks at a steep discount. But the market was ice cold, and the industry rumors were already swirling. The competitors knew Desmond was bleeding out. Why would they pay him 20 cents on the dollar today, when they could buy his trucks for pennies at a bankruptcy auction next month? Nobody was buying. By Thursday evening, the Fairfield mansion felt like a morgue. The grand colonial house was completely silent, save for the sound of my mother quietly weeping in the formal living room, terrified of losing her designer furniture and her elite social standing. Desmond sat behind his desk in the dark, staring blankly at the wall, a broken king watching his empire burn to the ground. That was when Terence walked back into the study carrying a sleek black leather portfolio. He looked remarkably calm, having spent the last 2 days desperately searching for a way to save his own skin and hide his embezzlement from a federal audit. "I found a way out, Desmond," Terence announced, dropping the portfolio onto the center of the desk. "I worked the phones day and night. I pulled every favor I had in the private wealth sector. I found a savior." My father slowly looked up, his eyes hollow and desperate. "Who? Who is willing to lend us $5 million in this market?" "They are not lending it," Terence corrected, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from the portfolio. "They are a highly aggressive ultra-private equity firm based right here in Atlanta. They operate completely in the shadows, strictly high-tier corporate acquisitions. They are called Vanguard Capital." Vanguard Capital. My father repeated the name, rolling it around in his mouth. He had never heard of them, which was exactly how I had designed my firm to operate. "I am not selling my company, Terence. I built this from the ground up." "You are not selling it entirely," Terence said smoothly, pulling up a chair and leaning in close, playing the role of the devoted advisor. "Desmond, listen to me. Vanguard is willing to assume the entire $5 million debt from First National Bank immediately. They will clear the default notice by tomorrow morning. The bank backs off, the house is safe, Elaine keeps her social standing, the trucks keep running, we survive." My father's eyes lit up with a fragile, desperate hope. The thought of keeping the mansion, of hiding this failure from his peers, was intoxicating. "What is the catch?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Private equity firms do not operate on charity. What do they want in return? Terrence hesitated for a fraction of a second, perfectly feigning reluctance. They want equity, Desmond. They are demanding a 51% controlling stake in the logistics company. They want the majority vote on the board. My father slammed his hand on the desk. Absolutely not. I will not hand over control of my own company. I am the president. I make the decisions. I will not become an employee in my own building. Desmond, wake up, Terrence shouted, finally dropping the respectful act and leaning into aggressive manipulation. You do not have a choice anymore. First National is going to seize the company by Friday. They are going to auction off your trucks, drain your bank accounts, and put a padlock on the front door of this mansion. 49% of a functioning debt-free company is better than 100% of absolute nothing. If you do not sign this term sheet tonight, you and Elaine will be sleeping in a motel next week, and Charmaine will have won. Do you want Charmaine to win? The mention of my name was the final push he needed. The sheer venomous pride in my father's heart could not fathom the idea of me watching him go totally bankrupt. He would rather give control to a faceless corporation than admit defeat to the daughter he had thrown away. My father reached for the heavy gold fountain pen sitting on his desk blotter. His hand shook violently as he uncapped it. He pulled the Vanguard Capital term sheet toward him. He was completely blinded by panic, totally consumed by his desire to maintain his fake image of success. He did not read the legal definitions of the asset seizure clauses. He did not read the stipulations regarding full forensic accounting audits that the new majority shareholder could trigger at any moment. Most importantly, he did not flip to the final page of the contract to review the signature block. He just wanted the pain to stop. He wanted the bank off his back. Desmond pressed the gold pen to the paper and signed his name on the dotted line, officially transferring 51% of his life's work to Vanguard Capital. Terrence smiled, a slick, greasy grin of pure relief. Terrence thought he had just secured his own job, saved his lavish lifestyle with Chloe, and successfully buried his massive financial crimes under the massive umbrella of a new corporate overlord. Neither of them bothered to look at the name printed clearly beneath the blank signature line designated for the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital. If they had just turned the page, they would have seen my name. They had just handed me the keys to their entire kingdom. With the signature drying on the page, Terrence believed he had pulled off the ultimate con. He had effectively shielded his massive embezzlement under the protective umbrella of Vanguard Capital, entirely unaware that Vanguard was simply a reflection of my own face. In Terrence's mind, the logistics company was saved. The $5 million debt was magically erased, and the corporate accounts were suddenly flush with fresh operating capital provided by the new majority shareholder. What he did not realize was that I was carefully monitoring every single cent that flowed into that account. I wanted to see exactly how long it would take for his greed to override his basic survival instincts. It took less than 72 hours. By Monday morning, Terrence and Chloe embarked on a spending spree so incredibly reckless and vulgar, it defied basic financial logic. They were celebrating a bailout they did not understand, with money they did not own. They marched into a high-end luxury auto dealership in Buckhead and purchased 2 brand-new Mercedes-Benz G-Wagons. They did not lease them. They bought them outright using a corporate wire transfer, categorizing the purchase under a fabricated and highly illegal fleet expansion budget. Chloe chose a stark, glossy white SUV with custom white leather interiors, while Terrence opted for an aggressive matte black model with heavily tinted windows and aftermarket rims. They were driving around the city enrolling monuments to their own impending federal indictments. But simply owning the vehicles was never enough for people like Chloe and Terrence. The wealth was entirely meaningless to them unless they could use it as a weapon to inflict pain on others. They needed an audience. They needed to rub their perceived victory in my face to validate their own fragile egos. On Tuesday afternoon, while Jamal and I were sitting on the front porch of our home enjoying the quiet spring weather, the obnoxious blare of heavy luxury car horns shattered the peace of our neighborhood. The two G-Wagons rolled down our quiet tree-lined street in a slow, aggressive convoy. They pulled up directly across from our driveway, illegally parking partially on the sidewalk. Terrence revved the massive engine of his black SUV, the heavy roar echoing off the surrounding houses and disturbing the neighbors. Chloe rolled down her passenger window, leaning out with a smug, oversized smile plastered across her face. She was wearing massive designer sunglasses and holding up a crystal glass of champagne, completely disregarding open container laws. "Hey there, Charmaine!" Chloe yelled over the sound of the idling engines. "We were just in the neighborhood and thought we would drop by to show you what real success actually looks like. I guess that little stunt you pulled at the church did not work out the way you planned, did it?" Terrence killed the engine and stepped out of his vehicle, leaning against the hood with his arms crossed. He wore a brand new designer suit that still had the faint crease of a fresh purchase. He looked at Jamal, a mock expression of deep pity on his face. "You should have taken the deal when we offered it at the country club, Jamal." Terrence sneered, his voice carrying across the manicured lawns. "The logistics company just secured a massive private equity partnership. We are completely untouchable now. We are richer than we have ever been, and you two are completely cut out. Desmond officially wrote you out of the family trust yesterday morning. You missed out on the gold rush, Charmaine. Enjoy your quiet, boring little life." Jamal simply took a sip of his coffee, completely unbothered by the theatrical display. He looked at the massive G-Wagons, then back at Terrence, his expression perfectly serene. "Those are beautiful trucks, Terrence," Jamal said calmly, his voice easily cutting through the tension. "Make sure you keep the interiors incredibly clean. I would hate for the repo men to have to detail them when they seize them next month." Terrence's face flushed a deep, violent shade of red. His fragile ego was instantly bruised by Jamal's total lack of intimidation. He slammed his hand against the hood of the expensive SUV, leaving a smudge on the matte finish. "Keep talking, you ex-con," Terrence shouted, losing his composure. "We own this city now. You are nothing but a forgotten footnote in this family's history." Chloe laughed, a sharp, grating sound that made my skin crawl. She tossed her empty champagne glass onto our pristine front lawn. "Better luck next lifetime, sister," she called out, rolling up her tinted window. They climbed back into their stolen luxury vehicles, revved the massive engines one last time, and sped away, leaving the heavy smell of expensive exhaust lingering in the afternoon air. I walked down the porch steps, calmly picked up the shattered glass from the grass, and threw it in the recycling bin. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I felt the cold, calculating thrill of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a trap. But Terrence's frustration over our total lack of jealousy quickly began to fester. He could not stand that his grand display of newly acquired wealth had completely failed to crush my spirit. He needed to hit me where he believed it would truly hurt. He needed to take away the one piece of leverage I still held over the family. He set his sights squarely on my grandmother's estate. The Fairfield property was sitting on incredibly valuable, highly sought-after land. Terrence knew that if he could force me into a distressed sale, he could use his newly replenished stolen corporate funds to buy the property through a dummy corporation at a fraction of its true market value. To achieve this, he launched a campaign of cowardly bureaucratic sabotage. Terrence spent the next 2 days submitting aggressive anonymous complaints to the Municipal Zoning Board and the City Health Department. He fabricated wildly exaggerated reports claiming the historic estate had severe structural damage, illegal and dangerous electrical wiring, and a massive undocumented pest infestation that posed a severe public health hazard to the surrounding upscale neighborhood. He demanded an immediate emergency inspection, knowing that if the city found even a fraction of the violations he invented, they could condemn the property, slap me with exorbitant daily fines, and force a rapid foreclosure. It was a petty, vicious strategy designed to overwhelm me with legal red tape and crushing financial stress. Early Thursday morning, a white municipal vehicle pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of my grandmother's estate. I was already there, having been notified of the pending inspection. I was waiting on the front steps with a hot cup of tea and a thick, perfectly organized binder of all recent property maintenance records. A weary-looking city inspector wearing a high-visibility vest and carrying a heavy metal clipboard stepped out of the vehicle. He looked incredibly apologetic and slightly embarrassed as he approached the porch. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, removing his hard hat and wiping his brow. "My name is Inspector Higgins. I am truly sorry to bother you so early, but my office received multiple high-priority anonymous complaints regarding severe code violations on this property. I am legally obligated to conduct a full exterior and interior walkthrough today." I smiled warmly, entirely unbothered, and opened the front door wide. "Please, Inspector Higgins, come right in. Take all the time you need. I have absolutely nothing to hide." For the next 2 hours, the inspector meticulously examined the entire property. He checked the foundation, inspected the modern electrical panels Jamal had recently upgraded, tested the plumbing, and found the entire estate to be in absolute pristine condition. My grandmother's house was a fortress impeccably maintained and deeply loved. As Inspector Higgins finished his tour in the grand foyer, he let out a heavy sigh and shook his head in visible frustration. "I sincerely apologize for wasting your morning, ma'am," Higgins said, making a few final aggressive notations on his clipboard. "This house is immaculate. It is perfectly up to modern code. Honestly, I do not know why someone would file such aggressive, detailed complaints. It is a complete waste of city resources. It feels entirely malicious." I leaned against the heavy oak banister, my tone perfectly conversational and lightly curious. "You said the complaints were anonymous, Inspector. Is there any way to know who is actively targeting my property?" Higgins hesitated for a long moment, looking around the beautiful, quiet house. He clearly felt bad for putting me through the ordeal. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Officially, I am not supposed to share this information with homeowners. But whoever filed these reports was incredibly sloppy. They used an online portal, and they submitted all 5 complaints from the exact same registered IP address within a 10-minute window. I pulled the digital log this morning just to verify the source before I drove out here." He reached into his chest pocket and handed me a small, folded piece of paper. "The IP address is registered to a private commercial server owned by a limited liability company called Apex Holdings Group. I do not know who they are, but they clearly have a grudge against you." I froze. The name hung in the air like a physical weight. Apex Holdings Group was the exact shell company I had seen listed on the forged ledger Terrence had handed me at the coffee shop days ago. It was the same dummy corporation he was using to funnel the embezzled funds out of my father's logistics company and into the Cayman Islands. Terrence was so arrogant, so blinded by his own perceived brilliance, that he had used his primary money laundering network to file a petty zoning complaint against my house. I looked down at the piece of paper in my hand. It was not just an IP address. It was a digital fingerprint. It was the smoking gun connecting Terrence's local harassment directly to his international wire fraud. Inspector Higgins had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the final irrefutable piece of the puzzle I needed to destroy my brother-in-law. I thanked the inspector profusely, offering him a cold bottle of water for the road. As soon as his white municipal truck pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, I pulled out my phone and dialed the direct number for my lead forensic accountant at Vanguard Capital. "I have the exact routing structure," I said, my voice cold and sharp the moment he answered the line. "I know exactly how Terrence is moving the money out of the logistics company. I am sending you the shell company name and IP address right now. Freeze their corporate accounts immediately and prepare the audit team for deployment. It is time to burn their fake empire to the ground." The order was executed with surgical precision. Within 30 minutes of my phone call, Vanguard Capital's legal team submitted the emergency injunctions to the federal banking regulators. Because we now legally held 51% of my father's logistics company and controlled the master debt, we had the absolute authority to freeze all subsidiary financial accounts pending a forensic audit. The freeze was completely silent. No alarms went off at the corporate office. No warning emails were sent to Terrence. It was late Friday afternoon, and the banks were closing for the weekend. The financial guillotine had dropped, but my family was completely oblivious, entirely focused on throwing the social event of the season. Saturday evening was the highly publicized 5-year anniversary party for Chloe and Terrence. Despite the fact that the family business had just narrowly avoided total bankruptcy mere days prior, Chloe felt entitled to a celebration of epic proportions. She had spared absolutely no expense, utilizing the corporate credit cards linked to the accounts I had just frozen to fund a $100,000 extravaganza. The venue was a breathtaking glass-enclosed rooftop botanical garden in the heart of downtown Atlanta, offering panoramic views of the city skyline. It was the kind of ultra-exclusive space that required a massive deposit months in advance, with the final, cripplingly large catering and entertainment balances scheduled to be charged to the card on the night of the event. Jamal and I did not receive an invitation, of course, but when you own the corporate entity funding the party, you do not need one. We arrived at the venue just after 8 o'clock. I wore a floor-length tailored emerald silk gown that whispered of quiet, undeniable wealth. Jamal wore a flawlessly cut midnight blue tuxedo. We stepped out of the private elevator and walked past the bewildered hostesses at the front desk, ignoring their clipboards entirely. We stepped into the main conservatory, and the sheer arrogant opulence of the room hit me like a physical wave. Chloe had transformed the botanical garden into a monument to her own vanity. Massive ice sculptures carved in the shape of swans flanked the entrance. A 20-piece live jazz orchestra played on a raised stage surrounded by imported white orchids. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated through the crowd of hundreds carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar, Wagyu beef sliders, and vintage champagne. Atlanta's absolute elite were their mayors, local celebrities, wealthy socialites, and every high-ranking member of our country club. It was a sickening display of stolen money, a glittering illusion built entirely on Terrence's wire fraud. We did not hide in his back. Jamal and I walked straight to the center of the room, standing gracefully near the towering champagne pyramid. It took less than 3 minutes for my sister to spot us. Chloe was wearing a custom heavily beaded silver gown that looked heavy enough to act as body armor. The moment her eyes locked onto me, her fake camera-ready smile instantly vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She aggressively tapped Terrence on the shoulder, pointing in our direction. They aggressively pushed their way through the crowd of wealthy guests, their faces flushed with anger. "What are you doing here?" Chloe hissed, keeping her voice low but vibrating with fury as she stopped inches from my face. "You are not invited, Charmaine. How did you even get past the front desk?" "We thought we would drop by and see what real success looks like," I replied, offering her a cool, entirely unbothered smile, echoing the exact taunt she had thrown at me from her stolen G-Wagon. "The ice sculptures are a nice touch, Chloe. Very subtle." Terrence stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to physically intimidate Jamal. "You need to leave right now," he demanded, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. "This is a private, elite event. You are trespassing. I am not going to let you ruin my wife's special night just because you are bitter and cut out of the family money." Jamal slowly looked Terrence up and down, his expression completely flat. "You should be enjoying the music, Terrence. It is going to be a very long time before you get to hear a live band again." Chloe gasped dramatically, clutching her diamond necklace. "Are you threatening us?" she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch and drawing the attention of several nearby guests. "Terrence, call security. Get them thrown out. I want them physically dragged out of here." The commotion had grown loud enough to attract the attention of the man who lived for the spotlight. My father, Desmond, marched over from the VIP lounge, followed closely by my mother, Elaine. Desmond was furious that the pristine optics of his daughter's party were being compromised. He saw Jamal and me standing there perfectly calm, and his deeply rooted hatred for my independence flared out of control. Desmond did not pull us aside to handle the situation quietly. He wanted to break me. He wanted to humiliate me in front of every important person in Atlanta to definitively prove his power. "Now security is going to escort you to the service elevator where you belong." Desmond raised his glass of champagne high into the air. "Let us toast to family, to loyalty, and to Vanguard Capital." The crowd erupted into polite applause, raising their glasses. Terrence smirked at me, a look of ultimate arrogant victory. Chloe crossed her arms, looking down her nose as four burly security guards in black suits pushed through the crowd, heading directly for Jamal and me. They expected me to cry. They expected me to scream, to make a scene, to beg for my father's forgiveness, or run away in profound humiliation. I did not do any of those things. I simply smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile of total peace. The head of security stopped in front of us, looking slightly apologetic. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." "Of course," I said softly. "We were just leaving." I turned away from my glowing, victorious family. I took Jamal's arm and we began walking toward the main exit. The crowd parted for us like the Red Sea, staring at us as if we were diseased. But before we reached the glass double doors, I stopped. The general manager of the venue, a stressed-looking man holding an electronic payment tablet, was standing near the exit, watching the drama unfold. I walked directly up to him. "Excuse me," I said, reaching into my emerald clutch. "Are you the event coordinator responsible for finalizing the payments tonight?" The manager nodded, looking confused. "Yes, ma'am. I am about to run the final corporate card for the catering, the bar, and the venue rental balance." "Why do you ask?" I pulled a thick white envelope from my bag and handed it to him. "I strongly suggest you look at the documents in that envelope before you serve another drop of champagne, or let that band play another note. Have a wonderful evening." Jamal and I walked out the glass doors and stepped into the private elevator. I turned around to face the party as the heavy metal doors began to slide shut. Through the glass walls, I watched the event manager rip open the envelope. Inside was a formal legal notice from Vanguard Capital confirming the absolute freeze of all logistics company bank accounts. Attached to it was the digital decline log from the corporate credit card Terrence had just tried to use to pay the massive outstanding balance. The card was dead, the accounts were locked, the money did not exist. I watched the exact moment the manager realized he was hosting a $100,000 party for a family that could not pay the bill. The elevator doors were closing, but I had a perfect view of the chaos. The manager sprinted across the room, completely ignoring the wealthy guests. He frantically waved his arms at the orchestra conductor, making a violent slashing motion across his throat. The music abruptly cut out again, this time entirely without Desmond's permission. The manager grabbed the microphone. "I am incredibly sorry, ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, his voice laced with absolute panic. "But we have a critical payment failure. This event is entirely unfunded. The bar is officially closed. All catering staff clear the floor immediately." The elevator doors clicked shut, plunging Jamal and me into the quiet, descending metal box. But even through the heavy doors, I could hear the sheer pandemonium erupting above us. I could hear the sound of waiters physically pulling plates of expensive food away from the elite guests. I could hear the bewildered shouts of the local politicians. And faintly cutting through it all, I could hear Chloe screaming in total catastrophic public humiliation. The Golden Child's anniversary bash was over. The empire was burning, and the audit was coming next. The rooftop botanical garden was just the appetizer. The main course was served at exactly 8 o'clock Monday morning. The logistics company headquarters, a sprawling glass and steel complex on the edge of the city, was usually a hub of loud engines, shouting dispatchers, and ringing phones. But this morning, the normal chaos was interrupted by an entirely different kind of operation. A fleet of 6 unmarked black SUVs pulled up to the front entrance in perfect unison. 30 men and women dressed in sharp charcoal suits stepped out, carrying heavy briefcases, stacks of empty evidence boxes, and secure data extraction servers. They were the elite forensic audit team dispatched directly from Vanguard Capital. Because Vanguard now legally held 51% of the company's shares and controlled the master debt, we possessed the unilateral, unquestionable authority to trigger a total financial lockdown. There was no need for a court order or a judge's signature. My father had signed his rights away with his own gold fountain pen. The auditors walked straight past the front desk, security ignoring the receptionist's frantic demands. They systematically fanned out across the executive floor like a military unit. They unplugged desktop computers, confiscated corporate cell phones from the vice presidents, and placed heavy brass padlocks on the physical filing room doors. They slapped bright red tamper-evident tape across the server room cabinets. My father arrived at 9 o'clock, his face pale and drawn, still nursing a massive hangover of humiliation from the disastrous weekend party. He stormed onto the executive floor, his booming voice demanding to know who authorized this invasion of his private business. The lead auditor, a cold, emotionless man named Mr. Vance, did not even blink. He simply handed Desmond a copy of the term sheet he had signed days earlier, highlighting the mandatory forensic audit clause in bright yellow ink. Desmond was rendered entirely powerless in his own building. He was forced to sit in the lobby while strangers dismantled his legacy piece by piece. But while my father felt angry and confused, Terence felt something much worse. Terence was in a state of absolute, unadulterated terror. He stood frozen in the hallway, watching through the glass walls of the accounting department as the auditors began mirroring the main corporate hard drives. Terence was a con artist, and like all con artists, he believed he was the smartest man in the room. But looking at the Vanguard team, he suddenly realized he was entirely outmatched. He knew his fabricated ledgers and sloppy spreadsheet alterations would not survive a deep forensic examination. These auditors would trace the Cayman Island routing numbers within 48 hours. They would find the invoices for the G-Wagons, the luxury vacations, and the fake anniversary party. Terence knew he was staring down the barrel of a massive federal indictment. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed one immediately. He needed to solidify the desperate lie he had fed my father. He remembered that 3 years ago, during my brief unpaid stint helping them organize their digital accounting software, I had an administrative login credential. More importantly, he remembered an old dormant employee expense account under my name that Human Resources had never properly closed. If Terence could plant the digital trail of the embezzled crypto funds into that old account, he could successfully frame me for the entire collapse. He could claim I had masterminded the theft from the outside, but he could not manipulate the system while Vanguard's auditors were crawling all over the building. He had to wait for nightfall. He had to wait until the building was completely empty. At exactly midnight, a sleek black shadow moved across the dark employee parking lot. Terence had parked his stolen G-Wagon 3 blocks away to avoid the perimeter security cameras. He approached the side service door of the logistics headquarters. He was sweating profusely despite the cool night air. His hands were shaking violently as he pulled out a physical emergency override key he had secretly copied months ago, bypassing the electronic badge scanners that Vanguard had already deactivated. The heavy metal door clicked open, and he slipped inside. The building was dark, silent, and incredibly eerie. The only illumination came from the glowing red emergency exit signs casting long, menacing shadows across the carpet. Terence crept up the back stairwell, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He bypassed the main server room, knowing it was likely wired with temporary Vanguard security alarms, and headed straight for his own corner office. He locked the heavy wooden door behind him and closed the window blinds tightly. He turned on a small desk lamp, casting a dim, frantic pool of light across his workspace. First, he needed to destroy the physical evidence. He opened his locked bottom desk drawer and pulled out thick files containing the actual bank statements from his offshore accounts, the real invoices for Chloe's diamond jewelry, and the wire transfer receipts that proved his guilt. He fed them into his industrial desk shredder one by one. The machine whined and ground the paper into tiny, illegible strips of confetti. He kept feeding the machine until the motor ran hot, and the bin was completely full. With the paper trail destroyed, he moved to the digital frame-up. Terence booted up a standalone laptop he kept hidden behind his bookshelf, a machine that was not connected to the main corporate network Vanguard was currently monitoring. He pulled a small silver USB drive from his pocket. This drive contained the master key to his crypto wallets and the digital receipts of every stolen dollar. It was the only digital map of his crimes. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He logged into the company's legacy cloud server using a backdoor portal. He located my old dormant expense account. Breathing heavily, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, he began initiating a series of complex data transfers. He forged timestamps to make it look like the missing $5 million had been routed directly through my personal credentials before disappearing into the ether. He was building a perfect, damning narrative against me. The progress bar on the screen slowly crept toward 100%. 97, 98, 99. Transfer complete. Terrence let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He slumped back in his expensive leather chair, wiping his face with both hands. He had done it. He had successfully shifted the blame. He reached forward and wiped the laptop's hard drive clean, entirely erasing his own digital footprints. The only thing left to do was destroy the silver USB drive, and he would be a completely free man. He reached out to unplug the drive from the side of the laptop. Suddenly, the harsh overhead fluorescent lights flicked on blindingly bright. Terrence flinched, crying out in shock, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes. His heart practically stopped in his chest. He spun his chair around, terrified that a Vanguard security guard had caught him. But it was not a security guard. Sitting in the corner of the office, deeply reclined in a plush leather guest chair, was Jamal. He was wearing a dark jacket, his legs casually crossed, looking incredibly relaxed. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been sitting in the dark for a very long time, patiently waiting for a rat to walk into a trap. Terrence froze, his blood running completely cold. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. How had Jamal gotten past the security doors? How long had he been sitting there watching him panic? Jamal slowly uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at the smoking paper shredder, then at the glowing laptop screen, and finally locked his cold, piercing eyes directly onto Terrence's terrified face. "You work very hard for a man who claims to be a genius, Terrence." Jamal said, his voice a low, smooth rumble that carried absolute authority. Terrence scrambled backward in his chair, his back hitting the glass window. "What are you doing here?" Terrence stammered, his voice cracking violently. "You are trespassing. I will call the police. I will tell them you broke in." Jamal smiled, a dark, chilling expression that did not reach his eyes. "You are not going to call anyone, Terrence. Because if you call the police, you will have to explain why you are sitting in a dark office at midnight, shredding documents during a federally mandated financial audit." Terrence swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the silver USB drive still plugged into the laptop. He lunged forward to grab it, desperate to destroy the final piece of evidence. But Jamal was faster, much faster. Jamal stood up smoothly, took 2 long strides across the room, and slapped his hand down hard on the desk, pinning Terrence's wrist against the wood. Terrence cried out in pain, dropping to his knees. Jamal reached over with his free hand and cleanly pulled the silver USB drive from the port. He held it up to the light, examining it carefully. "You spent all that time trying to plant fake evidence on my wife's old account," Jamal said softly, his grip on Terrence's wrist like an iron vice. "But you forgot one very important detail, Terrence. You cannot forge timestamps on a cloud server that Vanguard Capital already copied and secured 12 hours ago. We already have the original logs. We know you were the only one logged in." Jamal released Terrence's wrist. Terrence slumped to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his arm. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with crushing weight. His midnight operation had not saved him. It had only provided Vanguard with real-time surveillance footage of him tampering with evidence. He had literally recorded himself committing a federal crime. Jamal slipped the silver USB drive into his jacket pocket. He looked down at Terrence, who was now trembling uncontrollably on the expensive corporate carpet, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man who had flaunted his leased cars and fake watches. "You missed a file," Jamal said quietly. Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not throw a punch or make a physical threat. He simply turned his back on the ruined man on the floor, opened the office door, and walked out into the silent hallway. He left Terrence sitting in the blazing fluorescent light, sweating profusely, staring at the empty laptop screen, finally realizing that the game was entirely over and he had lost everything. Terrence did not stay on the floor for long. The survival instinct of a cornered animal is incredibly powerful, and Terrence was nothing if not a survivor. He knew that the silver drive Jamal had just taken contained the absolute entirety of his financial crimes. He also finally understood the terrifying reality of his situation. Vanguard Capital was not some faceless corporate entity that had swooped in to save the logistics company. Vanguard Capital was Charmaine. His quiet, supposedly broke sister-in-law had orchestrated the entire acquisition from the shadows. Terrence practically crawled out of the dark office, stumbled down the back stairwell, and sprinted across the parking lot to his illegally purchased SUV. He drove recklessly through the empty Atlanta streets, his mind racing to construct a defensive narrative before Jamal could hand the evidence over to the authorities. He knew he could not stop the federal audit, but he could try to muddy the waters. He needed to strike first. He needed to frame Jamal's midnight intervention as a violent, illegal attack. He arrived at the Fairfield mansion at 2 in the morning, aggressively pounding on the heavy front doors until the housekeeper let him in. He sprinted up the grand staircase and began hammering on my parents' bedroom door. Desmond and Elaine emerged a few moments later, wearing expensive silk sleepwear, their faces tight with sleep and irritation. "What is the meaning of this?" Desmond demanded, tying his robe. "Do you know what time it is?" Terrence collapsed to his knees in the carpeted hallway, putting on the performance of a lifetime. He forced tears into his eyes and began hyperventilating, clutching his wrist where Jamal had pinned him to the desk. "They attacked me, Desmond," Terrence gasped, his voice trembling with manufactured terror. "I was at the office late trying to finalize the Vanguard transition paperwork to make sure your legacy was protected." The power cut out. Suddenly, Jamal was there. He broke into the executive suite. He had 2 huge thugs with him. Elaine gasped, clutching her chest. "What are you talking about?" Jamal broke into the building. Terrence nodded frantically. "Yes, he assaulted me. He pinned me to the floor and threatened to kill me if I moved. They hacked into the master servers, Desmond. They stole the primary corporate data drives Charmaine sent him. I figured it out while they were holding me down. Charmaine is using Jamal to steal your client lists and your trade secrets so she can sell them to your competitors. She wants to completely destroy the logistics company before the Vanguard deal even clears." It was an absolutely absurd story full of glaring logistical holes. But Terrence knew exactly how to play his audience. He knew my parents were desperate to believe the worst about me, and he knew they were terrified of losing their social standing. My father's face turned a violent shade of purple. He did not question the logic of thugs hacking a server. He only heard the confirmation of his own deep-seated prejudice. He had always believed Jamal was a criminal, and now he had the fabricated proof he craved. "I told you!" Desmond roared, his voice echoing down the grand hallway. "I told you that boy was a violent thug. He is trying to rob me blind to fund her pathetic lifestyle." Elaine did not waste a single second on shock. Her shock instantly morphed into pure, venomous vengeance. She turned around, marched straight back into her bedroom, and picked up the phone from her nightstand. "What are you doing?" Desmond asked, following her into the room. "I am doing what we should have done the day she brought that convict into our family," Elaine spat, dialing the numbers with shaking fingers. "I am calling the police. I am reporting a violent break in corporate espionage and grand larceny. I am going to make sure Charmaine and her husband are locked in a federal penitentiary by sunrise." By 10 o'clock Tuesday morning, the sun was shining brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Vanguard Capital. I was reviewing the preliminary findings from my audit team, sipping a perfectly pulled shot of espresso when my intercom buzzed. "Ms. Wilson," my assistant's voice came through the speaker, sounding unusually tight. "There are 2 detectives from the Atlanta Police Department Commercial Crimes Division at the reception desk. They are demanding to speak with you immediately. They said they have a warrant." I did not feel a spike of panic. I did not rush to call my legal team. I simply smiled, pressed the intercom button, and replied in a perfectly calm voice. "Please escort the detectives back to my office, Sarah, and ask them if they take sugar in their coffee." A minute later, the heavy glass doors to my suite swung open. 2 detectives walked in, looking incredibly stern and fully prepared for a confrontation. They were wearing cheap suits and carrying thick leather notepads. They looked around the massive, luxurious office, clearly confused by the sheer scale of wealth surrounding the woman they had come to arrest for hiring street thugs. "Charmaine Wilson?" the older detective asked, stepping forward and flashing a gold badge. "I am Detective Miller, and this is Detective Hayes. We need you to step away from your computer and keep your hands where we can see them." We have a sworn statement alleging that you orchestrated a violent break-in and the theft of proprietary corporate data from Desmond Logistics last night. I remained seated in my plush leather chair. I folded my hands neatly on my desk and looked directly at them. "Good morning, detectives," I said pleasantly. "I assume my mother Elaine made that dramatic phone call." Detective Miller frowned, clearly thrown off by my total lack of fear. "Your mother and your brother-in-law filed the report. Your brother-in-law claims your husband assaulted him and stole server drives. This is a very serious felony charge, Ms. Wilson." I stood up slowly, walked over to my private espresso machine and poured 2 fresh cups. I carried them over to the small glass meeting table in my office and gestured for the detectives to sit. "Detectives, I completely understand you have a job to do," I said, taking my seat across from them. "But before you read me my rights, I strongly suggest you look at the documents sitting on the corner of my desk." Detective Hayes walked over to my desk. Sitting dead center on the pristine wood surface was a thick, heavy 3-ring binder. It was beautifully organized, complete with color-coded tabs and a glossy cover page. The title, printed in bold black letters, read, "Federal Wire Fraud Evidence. Terrence and Chloe." Hayes picked up the heavy binder and brought it back to the glass table, opening it with a look of deep skepticism. His skepticism lasted exactly 10 seconds. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I cannot steal data from a company I already own, detectives. If you check the first tab, you will see the fully executed corporate term sheet proving that my private equity firm, Vanguard Capital, legally acquired a 51% controlling stake in Desmond Logistics last Thursday. I have absolute unfettered legal access to every single server in that building. Miller looked at the term sheet, his eyes widening slightly. "Now flip to the second tab." I continued, my voice smooth and relentless. "You will find the high-definition security footage we pulled from the executive suite cameras at midnight last night. It clearly shows Terrence using an unauthorized physical key to break into the building during an active federally mandated financial audit. It shows him aggressively shredding massive amounts of corporate documents. And if you read the transcript on the next page, you will see my husband Jamal legally intervening as a representative of the majority shareholder to secure a stolen USB drive." Hayes was flipping through the pages rapidly, his face draining of color as he absorbed the sheer magnitude of the financial data presented to him. He was looking at actual offshore bank routing numbers, IP addresses, and digital crypto wallet transfers. "My brother-in-law did not call you because he was attacked," I explained, leaning forward and resting my arms on the table. "He called you because he is desperately trying to hide the fact that he has embezzled exactly $5 million from his own family over the last 3 years. The data drive my husband confiscated last night proves every single cent he stole. He is a fraud, and my mother is a very angry woman who was manipulated into filing a false police report." The 2 detectives sat in total silence for a long moment. They looked at the impeccable corporate suite. They looked at my perfectly calm demeanor, and they looked at the mountain of irrefutable evidence sitting in front of them. The case they thought they were walking into had just completely evaporated, replaced by a massive federal white-collar crime investigation that would likely make their careers. Detective Miller slowly closed the binder. He looked at me with a newfound expression of deep, profound respect. "Ms. Wilson," he said, clearing his throat, "may we take this binder down to the precinct? We are going to need to get the FBI involved immediately." "It is all yours, detective," I said, smiling warmly. "Take the espresso too. You are going to have a very long day." The detectives thanked me profusely, shook my hand, and walked out of my office, holding the binder like it was a brick of solid gold. They did not put me in handcuffs. They did not read me my rights. They simply left to go build a cage for my brother-in-law. I walked back to my desk and sat down. I opened my laptop to review the morning market trends. Less than 5 minutes later, my cell phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name, Elaine. She had undoubtedly been sitting by the phone all morning, eagerly waiting for the police department to call and confirm that I had been arrested and locked in a holding cell. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. "Are you in a cage yet, you monster?" Elaine screamed into the receiver, her voice shrill and vibrating with absolute malice. "You thought you could destroy this family. You thought you could send your thug husband to hurt Terrence and get away with it. You are a criminal, Charmaine. You are a disgrace to our bloodline. Your father is calling his lawyers right now to make sure you never see the outside of a prison wall again." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting her exhaust her toxic, venomous rant. When she finally paused to take a breath, the silence stretched over the line. "Are you done?" I asked, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. "What?" Elaine snapped, completely confused by my calm tone. "Why are you on your cell phone? Did they not confiscate it when they arrested you?" "Nobody arrested me, Elaine," I replied softly. "The detectives came. We had a lovely cup of coffee, and then they left with a fully documented file proving that Terrence has been stealing millions of dollars from Dad's company to buy Chloe's jewelry. They are handing the file over to the FBI as we speak." I heard a sharp, sudden gasp on the other end of the line, the sound of absolute terrifying realization. "You see, Mom?" I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "I own the company now. I bought the debt. I ordered the audit. And tomorrow night, Dad is hosting that ridiculous, expensive gala to celebrate his fake corporate success. I will be there." "Charmaine, wait." Elaine stammered, her arrogant tone suddenly replaced by a trembling, desperate panic. "Charmaine, please tell me you are lying. Please." I did not entertain her panic. I did not give her a single inch of comfort. I simply delivered the final blow. "Put on your best dress tomorrow night, Mother. It is the last time you will be able to afford wearing it." I hung up the phone, dropping it onto the pristine surface of my desk. The desperate ploy had failed. The stage was finally set for the ultimate collapse. Thursday evening descended upon Atlanta with a heavy, suffocating heat, but inside the grand ballroom of the Crystal Atrium, the air was perfectly chilled and fragrant with imported white lilies. My father had spared absolutely no expense for his corporate restructuring gala. He had rented the most exclusive venue in the city, a towering architectural masterpiece made entirely of glass and polished steel, offering a 360-degree view of the glittering downtown skyline. This was not just a business dinner. This was a coronation. It was Desmond's desperate, lavish attempt to prove to the world that his legacy was untouchable. The room was packed with the highest echelons of Atlanta society. State senators, local politicians, prominent megachurch leaders, and rival logistics CEOs mingled under the massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white coats glided silently across the marble floors, offering silver trays loaded with seared scallops and vintage champagne. In the back of the room, two separate camera crews from the local news stations were setting up their equipment, their bright spotlights cutting through the dim, romantic lighting of the ballroom. Desmond had personally invited the press to document his triumphant return from the brink of financial disaster. At the front of the room, sitting at the head of a massive, heavily decorated VIP table, was my family. They looked like absolute royalty, but if you looked closely, the illusion was beginning to aggressively fracture. Elaine sat rigidly in her chair, wearing a stunning silver sequined gown that must have cost a small fortune. But her face was a tight gray mask of pure terror. Ever since our phone call the previous morning, she had been vibrating with a quiet, suppressed panic. She had not told my father about our conversation. She had not warned him about the police detectives or the federal evidence. She was too terrified of his wrath and too deeply addicted to the illusion of this gala to stop the train before it crashed. She continuously dabbed her upper lip with a silk napkin, her eyes constantly darting toward the heavy mahogany entrance doors, waiting for the monster she created to walk through them. Beside her sat Chloe, entirely oblivious to her mother's panic. Chloe was completely in her element, wearing a dramatic, plunging red gown and the very same $50,000 diamond necklace bought with stolen funds. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back, posing for the society photographers who snapped pictures of her holding a crystal flute of champagne. She believed she was hours away from being officially named the sole heir to a massive corporate empire. And then there was Terrence. Terrence looked like a dead man whose heart had simply forgotten to stop beating. He was sweating profusely through his bespoke tuxedo. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of his usual arrogant spark. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew Jamal had the silver USB drive containing his entire confession. He knew the FBI was likely already drafting his arrest warrant. But Terrence was a coward trapped in a cage of his own making. He could not run without raising suspicion, and he could not confess without facing Desmond's fury. So he sat there gripping his water glass so hard his knuckles were white, drinking heavily, and silently praying for a miracle that was never going to come. Desmond, however, was in absolute paradise. He stood near the podium, shaking hands with the mayor of Atlanta, clapping powerful men on the shoulder, and radiating a sickening level of pride. He was completely blind to his wife's terror and his son-in-law's collapse. He honestly believed he had outsmarted the banks, outplayed the financial markets, and successfully insulated his wealth from my supposedly jealous grasp. At exactly 8 o'clock, the soft jazz music faded away, and the grand ballroom lights dimmed. A hush fell over the hundreds of elite guests as the mayor stepped up to the acrylic podium. The news cameras instantly flipped on, casting a harsh, bright light on the center stage. "Good evening, Atlanta!" The mayor boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing through the massive glass room. "Tonight we are here to celebrate a cornerstone of our local economy. For over 3 decades, Desmond Logistics has been a shining example of hard work, dedication, and community excellence. And tonight, as they announce a groundbreaking new partnership that will secure their future for generations to come, I am honored to introduce the man who built it all. Please give a warm welcome to my good friend Desmond." The ballroom erupted into thunderous standing applause. My father buttoned his tuxedo jacket, puffing out his chest, and walked up the steps to the stage. He shook the mayor's hand warmly, stepped up to the microphone, and looked out over the sea of wealthy, influential faces. He waited for the applause to die down, soaking in the admiration, like a man dying of thirst. "Thank you. Thank you all so much." Desmond began, his voice thick with practiced emotion. "Looking out at this room tonight, I am overwhelmed by the support of my true friends, my colleagues, and my community. Building an empire is not easy. It requires sacrifice. It requires a relentless drive. But most importantly, it requires knowing exactly who you can trust." He paused dramatically, resting his hands on the edges of the podium, leaning forward to deliver his prepared narrative. "This past year has been a season of incredible trials for my company and for my family." Desmond continued, his voice dropping to a solemn, serious register. "We faced aggressive challenges from the shifting economy, but the most painful trials did not come from the market. They came from within. Recently, my family survived a vicious, calculated betrayal from our own blood." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Elaine closed her eyes tightly, looking like she might be physically sick. Chloe smirked, loving the drama. "We were targeted by someone consumed by jealousy and greed." Desmond projected, entirely committed to playing the victim, someone who tried to use lies and sabotage to tear down everything I have built. "It is a heartbreaking reality when the people you raise try to destroy you. But I am standing here tonight to tell you that light will always conquer darkness, and true loyalty will always prevail over bitter entitlement." He turned his gaze toward the VIP table, extending a hand toward Terrence and Chloe. "When the storms came, my youngest daughter Chloe and my brilliant son-in-law Terrence stood by my side as a shield," Desmond declared proudly. Terrence worked day and night, utilizing his incredible financial expertise to secure a massive partnership that not only saved our company, but positioned us to double our fleet by next year. They are the future of this empire. They are the true legacy of the Desmond name. The crowd broke into another round of polite, supportive applause. Terrence tried to force a smile for the news cameras, but it looked more like a painful grimace. "And that brings us to the real reason we are celebrating tonight," Desmond said, his voice rising in triumphant crescendo. "We are officially merging our operations with one of the most powerful elite private equity firms in the nation, a firm that recognized the massive value of our logistics network and stepped in to completely clear our corporate debt. They operate in the shadows, but tonight they step into the light. Desmond looked toward the back of the room, his face glowing with absolute victory. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to formally invite the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital to the stage to officially formalize our new partnership. The audience turned in unison, looking toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the rear of the ballroom. The news cameras quickly pivoted, their bright spotlights sweeping across the room to illuminate the entrance. The orchestra began playing a triumphant, swelling piece of classical music to score the grand entrance. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The doors remained firmly shut. Desmond cleared his throat, looking slightly confused, and gestured again toward the back of the room. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors swung open with a loud, echoing crack that cut perfectly through the orchestra music. I stepped through the threshold. I was wearing an impeccably tailored, razor-sharp crimson power suit that stood out like a warning siren against the sea of black tuxedos and silver gowns. I did not walk in alone. Flanking me on my right was Jamal, wearing a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, his expression entirely unbothered and dangerously calm. Flanking me on my left were 3 senior partners from Vanguard Capital's corporate litigation team, carrying thick leather briefcases and projecting an aura of absolute legal authority. The moment the ballroom crowd recognized my face, a collective suffocating shock swept through the venue. The whispers exploded instantly. People recognized me as the daughter Desmond had just publicly disowned minutes ago. 4 venue security guards immediately rushed toward us, responding to Desmond's previous orders that I was permanently banned from his events. "Sir, ma'am, you cannot be in here," the head of security aggressively stated, reaching out to grab my arm. Before his fingers could even graze my sleeve, my lead corporate attorney stepped directly in front of him, slapping a heavy federal court injunction right against the guard's chest. "Do not touch her," the lawyer ordered, his voice echoing loudly. "She is the majority shareholder of the company hosting this event. If you attempt to restrict her movement, you will be named in a federal lawsuit before you wake up tomorrow morning. Stand down." The security guards looked at the federal seal on the document, looked at the sheer confidence radiating from our group, and immediately backed away, raising their hands in surrender. I did not stop walking. I glided down the center aisle of the ballroom, the crowd parting rapidly to get out of my way. The news cameras followed my every step, broadcasting the incredible spectacle live across the city. Up on the stage, the color completely drained from my father's face. He grabbed the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white, his jaw hanging completely slack. He looked like a man watching a tidal wave approach the shore, entirely unable to comprehend the scale of his impending destruction. At the VIP table, Elaine finally broke, burying her face in her hands and letting out a quiet, pathetic sob. Chloe shot out of her chair, her mouth wide open in disbelief. Terrence simply closed his eyes and lowered his head, knowing the executioner had arrived. I walked up the carpeted steps to the stage. My father did not try to stop me. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment. I stepped directly into the blinding glare of the news spotlight, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who had just spent the last 10 minutes assassinating my character to hundreds of people. I reached out and calmly took the microphone from his trembling hand. I looked out at the massive crowd, locking eyes with the local news cameras, and smiled a sharp, terrifying smile. "Thank you for the introduction, Dad." The words echoed through the massive ballroom, hanging in the chilled air like a suspended executioner's blade. My father froze completely. The pompous, victorious smile he had worn just seconds ago melted into a grotesque mask of total confusion. He looked at the microphone in my hand, then at the 3 corporate lawyers standing behind me, and finally at Jamal, who was watching him with cold, unyielding eyes. I turned my attention away from my father and looked directly out into the sea of bewildered faces. The local news cameras zoomed in, their red recording lights blinking steadily, broadcasting this exact moment to hundreds of thousands of living rooms across Atlanta. "My name is Charmaine," I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy silence with absolute precision. "And despite what you were just told, I am not a jealous, bitter freelancer. I am the founder, sole owner, and chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital." A collective audible gasp ripped through the crowd. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Elite socialites covered their mouths in horror. Rival logistics. CEOs whispered frantically to their spouses, their eyes wide with sudden realization. The mayor sitting in the front row abruptly sat up straight, his political instincts sensing a massive, unprecedented scandal unfolding live on television. Desmond stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes scraping loudly against the wooden stage. "No," he whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is impossible. You do not have the capital. You do not have the infrastructure." Terrence negotiated with a private equity firm. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the crowd. That is correct. Terrence negotiated with a firm he did not bother to thoroughly research, representing a man he believed was an easy mark. He signed a term sheet, transferring a 51% controlling stake of Desmond Logistics directly to my holding company. I own the master debt, I own the voting rights, I own the company. Liar. The piercing shriek shattered the tension in the room. Chloe had jumped up from the VIP table, her face twisted in an ugly, desperate rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me, the stolen $50,000 diamond necklace glittering at her throat under the chandelier light. "Do not listen to her," Chloe screamed, her voice bordering on hysterical. "She is lying. She rented these lawyers just like she rented that Porsche. She is trying to ruin my husband's incredible deal. Terrence saved this family. Terrence is a genius." I looked down at my sister. The delusion was so deeply entrenched that she was willing to embarrass herself on live television rather than face the truth. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I did not need to. I had something far more powerful than volume. I raised my left hand and snapped my fingers once. Immediately, the three Vanguard Capital lawyers moved into action. One of them stepped over to the ballroom audiovisual booth, flashing his federal paperwork at the terrified technician. The soft, ambient corporate graphics playing on the two massive LED screens flanking the stage abruptly vanished. They were instantly replaced by a stark, high-resolution presentation. The Vanguard Capital logo flashed on the screens for a split second, followed immediately by the title slide of our forensic audit. The sheer scale of the financial data projected behind me was overwhelming. The screens displayed a complex, brilliantly organized web of routing numbers, offshore accounts, and digital wire transfers. It was not a theory. It was irrefutable, legally binding proof. I turned my body slightly so I could gesture toward the glowing screens. "Let us talk about the genius of Terrence," I said, my voice dripping with cold, clinical authority. "For the past 3 years, my brother-in-law has been utilizing a network of dummy corporations to systematically bleed Desmond Logistics dry. He did not save the company from the shifting economy. He created the financial crisis entirely on his own." I clicked a small remote in my hand, advancing the slide. A massive blown-up image of a bank statement appeared. "You see those routing numbers?" I asked the crowd, pointing to the highlighted yellow text on the screen. "Those trace directly to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange based in the Cayman Islands. Terrence initiated those transfers under the guise of fake vendor invoices and bloated fleet maintenance budgets. He stole exactly $5 million from his own family." The murmurs in the crowd escalated into loud, angry chatter. The logistics competitors in the room were pointing at the screens, instantly recognizing the fraudulent accounting tactics. I clicked the remote again. 2 side-by-side photos appeared on the giant screens. On the left was the invoice for the 2 brand-new Mercedes-Benz G-Wagons Chloe and Terrence had purchased days ago. On the right was the corporate wire transfer that funded them, pulled directly from the emergency Vanguard bailout money. "He bought luxury cars with the money I provided to keep your delivery trucks running," I announced. I clicked the remote again. A high-definition close-up of a jewelry store receipt filled the screens. "He bought the $50,000 diamond necklace currently resting on Chloe's neck using the employee pension fund." Chloe gasped, her hands flying up to cover the diamonds as if they were suddenly burning her skin. She looked frantically at Terrence, expecting him to stand up and aggressively defend her, to shout down the lies and prove his innocence. But Terrence was completely paralyzed. He sat slouched in his chair, staring blankly at the floor, sweat pouring down his face, completely defeated. I saved the most poetic piece of evidence for last. I clicked the remote one final time. A detailed catering and venue invoice appeared on the screens. It was the exact bill for the Crystal Atrium Gala we were currently attending. And tonight I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly through the massive room. This beautiful, extravagant celebration of family loyalty and corporate triumph was funded by a stolen credit card linked to an account that I officially froze on Friday afternoon. My father is hosting a party to celebrate his legacy with money he absolutely does not possess. The mayor stood up immediately, gesturing aggressively for his security detail. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with this radioactive scandal. Several other high-profile politicians quickly followed suit, quietly slipping toward the exits, desperate to avoid the news cameras recording the disaster. I finally turned around to face my father. Desmond was clinging to the podium, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked 10 years older than he had when I walked into the room. The grand illusion he had spent his entire life building was lying in shattered, jagged pieces on the ballroom floor. "Charmaine," he choked out his voice, a pathetic, weak whisper. "Charmaine, you cannot do this. We are family. I am your father." I stepped closer to him, lowering my voice so only he and the front row could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "You made it very clear that I am not your daughter. You disowned me publicly not 10 minutes ago. You threw me away because I did not fit your aesthetic, and you embraced a parasite because he wore a nice suit and flattered your massive ego." I leaned in slightly, locking eyes with the man who had tormented me for 35 years. "I didn't ruin your business. Your golden son-in-law did. And because I own the majority debt, I am legally seizing all company assets." My father shook his head, tears finally welling in his arrogant eyes. "No. No, you cannot take my company." "I already have," I replied coldly. "My lawyers filed the paperwork an hour ago. The warehouse, the trucks, the operational licenses. They all belong to me now." I let that reality sink in for a heavy, agonizing moment before I delivered the final fatal blow. "Including the house you put up for collateral," I added softly. "You leveraged the Fairfield mansion to secure that loan. Vanguard Capital now holds the deed. I am foreclosing on your property tomorrow morning." A blood-curdling scream ripped from the VIP table. It was not Elaine, who had completely fainted in her chair, slumping over the untouched plates of caviar. It was Terrence. The reality of decades in federal prison and absolute financial ruin finally snapped the last remaining thread of his sanity. He realized he had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no one left to con. His paralyzing fear instantly transformed into a violent, explosive rage. "You ruined me!" Terrence roared, kicking his chair backwards so hard it shattered against the marble floor. He launched himself across the space between the VIP table and the stage. He was not thinking rationally. He just wanted to hurt me. He charged up the carpeted steps, his hands curled into fists, his face contorted into an unrecognizable mask of pure hatred. He lunged directly at my throat. I did not even flinch. I did not step back, because I did not have to. Before Terrence could even cross the threshold of the stage, Jamal moved. He did not shout or strike a fighting stance. He moved with the terrifying, practiced efficiency of a man who had survived the rough streets of his youth and learned exactly how to handle real violence. Jamal stepped smoothly into Terrence's path, effortlessly catching the larger man's swinging arm. With a brutal, fluid motion, Jamal twisted Terrence's wrist, completely neutralizing his momentum, and drove a powerful shoulder directly into his chest. Terrence's feet left the ground entirely. Jamal lifted him and slammed him violently downward. Terrence crashed backward off the stage, his body smashing directly into a lavishly decorated banquet table. Crystal champagne flutes shattered into a million sparkling pieces. Silver trays of hot food flew into the air. The heavy wooden table collapsed under the immense impact, pinning Terrence to the floor in a tangled mess of white linen and broken glass. The ballroom erupted into sheer, unadulterated chaos. Guests screamed and scrambled backward, desperate to get out of the way. Chloe fell to her knees beside the wreckage, sobbing hysterically, completely ignoring her husband and desperately trying to gather the scattered pieces of her shattered dignity. Jamal stood at the edge of the stage, casually straightening the cuffs of his charcoal suit, looking down at the groaning, defeated man on the floor. He did not break a sweat. And right on cue, the wail of heavy sirens pierced the night air. The sound started faintly in the distance but rapidly grew louder, echoing off the towering glass walls of the crystal atrium. Red and blue emergency lights began flashing violently through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the panicked ballroom in the frantic colors of justice. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room burst open for the second time that night. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI printed in bold yellow letters stormed into the venue, their hands resting cautiously on their tactical belts. The trap had officially closed, the empire was gone, and my revenge was absolute. The FBI did not enter the crystal atrium quietly. They stormed the grand ballroom with overwhelming calculated force. A dozen agents in tactical gear poured through the mahogany doors, completely ignoring the screaming socialites and the frantic local politicians. They moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, cutting straight through the shattered remains of the banquet table toward the stage. Terrence was still trapped under the heavy white linens and broken crystal, groaning in pain, trying to push himself up. He did not even have the chance to stand before two massive federal agents grabbed him by the arms, dragging him violently to his feet. Terrence Brooks, the lead agent, barked, his voice carrying easily over the chaos of the room. You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Terrence did not fight them. The fight had completely left his body the moment the sirens wailed. He went completely limp, sobbing openly, his tears mixing with the sweat on his face. As the cold metal handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound echoed loudly through the microphone still lying on the stage. The reality of a 20-year federal sentence had finally caught up with his absolute arrogance. But Terrence was not the only target. Chloe, who had been kneeling in the broken glass screaming at Jamal, suddenly realized what was happening. She saw the FBI agents dragging her husband away, and her primal instinct was not loyalty, it was self-preservation. She scrambled to her feet, her heavy red gown dragging across the floor, and tried to run toward the service exit behind the kitchen. She did not make it 10 feet. A female federal agent stepped directly into her path, grabbing Chloe by the shoulder and spinning her around. Chloe Brooks, the agent said coldly. You are under arrest as a primary accessory to federal wire fraud and the receipt of stolen corporate funds. Put your hands behind your back. Chloe let out a sound that was less human and more like a cornered animal. No! She shrieked, thrashing wildly, trying to hit the agent with her heavy diamond necklace. I did not do anything. He gave me the money. I did not know it was stolen. I am innocent. It took two agents to finally subdue her, wrestling her arms behind her back and snapping the handcuffs into place. The golden child, the perfect heir to the Desmond legacy, was being publicly paraded out of her own celebration, in handcuffs, mascara running down her face in thick black streaks, screaming for a father who could no longer save her. My father stood frozen at the podium. He had not moved an inch since I took the microphone from his hand. He was completely catatonic. He watched his golden son-in-law, the man he trusted over his own flesh and blood, being dragged away for stealing $5 million from his life's work. He watched his beautiful daughter, the child he had groomed to take over his empire, being arrested as a common criminal. The sheer magnitude of his failure crashed down on him, physically crushing the breath from his lungs. Desmond clutched his chest, his face turning a sickly pale gray. He sank slowly to his knees on the stage, the reality of his massive, blinding ego finally breaking him in half. He had sacrificed his relationship with a brilliant, loyal daughter simply because she refused to play the game of optics. He had handed his entire kingdom to a snake, and he had done it with a smile. But Elaine was not ready to surrender. As the agents hauled Chloe past the VIP table, Elaine finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She let out a hysterical, entirely unhinged wail and threw herself across the room. She did not run to comfort her arrested daughter. She ran straight toward me. Elaine collapsed at the bottom of the stage stairs, throwing herself forward and aggressively grabbing the hem of my crimson silk suit. "Charmaine, please!" Elaine screamed, her voice tearing through her throat, tears streaming down her heavily made-up face. "Please, you have to stop them. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them Vanguard Capital will drop the charges. We are blood, Charmaine. We are your family. You cannot let them take your sister. You cannot put her in a cage. She is not strong enough. I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years making sure I knew I was a disappointment. The woman who had thrown my cheap coat across a dining room told me I was a disgrace and called the police, attempting to frame my husband for a felony just 24 hours ago. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt entirely wonderfully empty of any emotional obligation to this woman. I reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my silk pants. I stepped back, severing the physical connection. "You told me never to come back to your house, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing the exact words she had thrown at me on that fateful Sunday night. "Do not worry, I will not. Because the bank owns it now, and tomorrow the moving trucks will be there to clear it out." Elaine gasped, falling backward onto the marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The final pillar of her false superiority had collapsed. She was no longer the matriarch of an elite family. She was the mother of a convicted felon, and she was entirely homeless. I turned away from the wreckage. Jamal was waiting for me at the bottom of the stage steps, his expression entirely calm, a quiet, powerful anchor in the middle of a hurricane. He offered me his arm. I took it, linking my hand through his, and we began the long walk back out of the grand ballroom. The crowd of elite socialites and business rivals parted for us immediately, giving us a wide, terrified berth. No one spoke. The only sound in the massive venue was the frantic clicking of camera shutters. The local news crews were capturing every single second, the blinding white flashes, illuminating our path out of the darkness. We walked past the shattered ice sculptures. We walked past the abandoned trays of expensive champagne. We walked past the ghost of my father's empire. We turned our backs on the screaming, broken family we had finally escaped, and we walked out into the cool Atlanta night, stepping into the brilliant future we had built entirely on our own. 6 months have passed since that night at the Crystal Atrium. The crisp autumn air has finally settled over Atlanta, bringing with it a profound sense of clarity and peace. The logistics company my father spent his entire life building no longer bears his name. Under the direct management of Vanguard Capital, we completely restructured the organization from the ground up. We erased the Desmond name from every warehouse, every corporate letterhead, and every single delivery truck in the fleet. The company is now known as Apex Global Freight. Without Terrence siphoning millions into his offshore accounts, and without my father's bloated executive expense accounts dragging down the margins, the company is more profitable than it has ever been in its 30-year history. We raised the wages of the warehouse workers, replaced the aging trucks, and streamlined the entire supply chain. I did not destroy the company. I saved it by removing the rot. The rot, of course, was surgically extracted by the federal government. Terrence did not even attempt to fight the charges in court. The mountain of irrefutable digital evidence we handed over to the FBI left him with absolutely no room to maneuver. He accepted a plea deal to avoid a drawn-out public trial. Today, the man who used to mock my husband for wearing plain cotton shirts is wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Terrence is currently serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. There is no early parole in the federal system. He has a decade to sit in a concrete cell and think about the counterfeit Patek Philippe watch and the leased luxury cars that cost him his entire life. Chloe did not fare much better. Because she was officially listed as an accessory and had knowingly received stolen corporate funds, the government seized absolutely everything she owned. The bank took back the matching white G-Wagon. The authorities confiscated the $50,000 diamond necklace, her designer handbags, and her custom wardrobe to help pay down the massive court-ordered financial restitution. She managed to avoid prison time by cooperating completely with the investigators, turning entirely against her husband the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. But her freedom came with a heavy price. The golden child, the woman who used to sneer at me for working from home, is now working 40 hours a week at a discount retail store in a strip mall on the outskirts of the city. She wears a polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She spends her days folding discounted sweaters and ringing up clearance shoes, for the very same working-class people she spent her entire life looking down upon. I heard through the grapevine that a few of her former country club friends occasionally walk into the store just to watch her work the cash register. As for my parents, their devastating fall from grace was absolute and entirely public. When Vanguard Capital officially foreclosed on the Fairfield mansion, my parents were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. The bank auctioned off the estate to a young tech billionaire who immediately tore down my mother's beloved rose gardens. Desmond and Elaine now live in a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they previously would not have even driven through. Their beloved high society completely abandoned them. The elite social circles of Atlanta are incredibly unforgiving to those who lose their wealth, and even more unforgiving to those touched by federal scandal. They were permanently banned from the Oakmont Reserve Country Club by Jamal. Pastor Davis quietly asked them to stop attending the megachurch, claiming their presence was too disruptive to the congregation. They lost their friends, their status, and their entire identity. They are completely isolated, trapped in a tiny apartment with nothing but their bitter regrets and each other for company. This morning, my assistant walked into my office and handed me a standard white envelope. It was not routed through our corporate legal department. It was sent directly to my personal attention. I recognized the elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting immediately. It was from my mother. I held the envelope in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of the paper. I knew exactly what was inside. It was a letter begging for forgiveness. It was a plea for financial help, a desperate attempt to manipulate my emotions, and a fabricated apology designed solely to get them back into my good graces now that I held the keys to the kingdom. A year ago, I might have opened it. A year ago, the little girl inside me who just wanted her parents to love her might have eagerly torn the seal, hoping to finally read the words she had spent 35 years waiting to hear. But that little girl does not exist anymore. I did not open the envelope. I did not even break the seal. I simply turned around, walked over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder sitting in the corner of my office, and dropped the letter into the slot. The machine whined briefly, chewing the heavy paper into 100 meaningless ribbons. I did not feel sad. I felt incredibly, wonderfully free. I left the office early today. When I pulled my car into the long, winding driveway of my grandmother's historic estate, the sound of loud, joyful music drifted through the crisp air. I walked around to the expansive backyard. It was a picture of absolute perfection. We had fully renovated the property, restoring it to its former glory and adding a massive outdoor kitchen. Jamal was standing by the massive stone grill wearing a comfortable shirt, laughing loudly as he flipped burgers and ribs. The yard was filled with dozens of people. My brilliant software team, Jamal's loyal real estate partners, neighbors, who treated us with genuine kindness, and friends who had supported us long before we had corporate empires. It was our chosen family. There were no fake smiles, no whispered judgments, and absolutely no toxicity allowed. Jamal saw me walking across the pristine lawn. He handed the grill tongs to a friend, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked over to meet me. He wrapped his arms around my waist, kissing my forehead. "You made it." Jamal smiled, his eyes reflecting the warm afternoon sun. "How was the office?" "The office is perfect," I replied, leaning into his embrace and looking around at the beautiful, peaceful life we had built. Everything is exactly the way it is supposed to be. I realized then that the greatest revenge was never about destroying my family's empire or exposing their lies to the world. The ultimate, sweetest revenge was simply moving on and living flawlessly without them. Dưới đây là bài học rút ra từ câu chuyện khoảng 104 và một câu kêu gọi hành động CTA bằng tiếng Anh theo đúng yêu cầu của bạn. Lesson learned. The greatest lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by those who blindly underestimate you, even if they are your own family. Toxic loyalty and blood ties should never force you to accept disrespect, manipulation, or abuse. True power comes from quietly building your own foundation, staying grounded in the truth, and refusing to play the victim. When you focus on your own growth, instead of constantly seeking their conditional validation, you strip away their control. Ultimately, the sweetest revenge isn't about destroying others. It is about thriving in absolute peace with the family you choose. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and build your own empire, share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering journeys.